Hello, I'm Eric Walenza, founder of IoT One, and this is the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Every episode, I interview one expert about a project that is impacting businesses today. Visit us at iot1.com to learn more, or email me to start a discussion. Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight. I'm joined today by Steve Dertien, who is CTO for PTC's CAD and PLM businesses. Steve, what would you like to introduce about your background to give us a foundation where you're coming from before we kick off into the conversation?
Yeah, so great question. I've been at PTC 17 years, covering a lot of our engineering disciplines, if you will, through the early days of PTC's journey in digital engineering. So our CAD and our PLM offerings that a lot of our industrial type customers use, and through the years, ultimately, worked on our technology strategy, which led to PTC moving into both the IoT and the augmented reality space, and the implications of those technologies on our customers.
As normal, we're going to break our conversation with Steve today into three sections. First, we'll look at the company, PTC. We'll look at the markets that they're playing in, how their markets and the company itself are evolving. Then we'll do a deep dive in the second section into PTC's technology. They've got some great new technology coming to market, Thingworx 8, augmented reality solutions. And then finally, in the third section, we'll do a deep dive into one or two use cases where we'll look at how customers are engaging, how we're measuring results, and bring out a couple clear examples. First, then, focusing on the company. Steve, give us a quick overview of PTC as a business. You've obviously evolved quite a bit over the past, let's say, 10 years from, let's say, a market-leading, but quite a traditional industrial software company, and now you're pushing the bounds in the IoT space. Walk us a bit through that evolution over the past 10 years.
Kind of like I indicated in our intro, we're one of the first companies to pioneer how companies would do 3D design in CAD. And so our first customer would be John Deere, would be representative of a company that actually designs and engineers a mechanical product, if you will. Over the ages, that evolved into, how do you coordinate those designs across team members? How do you coordinate that across the enterprise as the design challenges and product development became more global? And as it did that, we also saw how software was eating the world, to kind of make a familiar reference there, and started looking at what the implications would be of software and the overall change in the design process that would undergo as you have all the electrical and the compute that goes into those products. And just following the natural life cycle of a product, right? So that's a lot of engineering born challenges. We have further moved into some manufacturing areas, which I think we'll talk about the implications of IoT there shortly. So maybe I'll save that for the moment. And then ultimately how customers service those products. So think, whether it's John Deere and large agricultural type equipment, or medical device manufacturers, to even some of the best names in retail and apparel are all PTC customers. But for those that have large products that are actually out there, how could we ultimately service them better? How could we help them on getting the right part to the right place at the right time? Reduce truck rolls for field service technicians. And so we really became a kind of a thought leader in this idea of closed loop lifecycle, or full lifecycle management of a product. So from its inception all the way through, perhaps even to its retirement. Ultimately, what we brought AR and IoT into the mix for is to kind of give us that line of sight, because the evolutionary aspect of PTC in the last few years has been a recognition, if you will, that once a company fields a product and puts it out into the market, it doesn't really become lifecycle management if you lose sight of it. And so IoT kind of allows us to make that connection, hold on to that relationship to that product, understand how it's being used. And I think a lot of our listeners today to the podcast would kind of self-recognize what the implications are for a company like Tesla, for example, which has really, really embraced IoT. I don't know that they would necessarily advertise that they're doing it, but the idea that they're able to understand how their cars are performing, change and deliver new value over time. It's really, that's on the verge of all the revolutionary aspects of how this technology can transform an organization. So maybe a good example to start with them.
Yeah, let's dwell on this a little bit, this concept, software is eating the world. So you're working with some companies like John Deere, which are really leading in adoption in their spaces. I'm based in Shanghai here, and we see it, from two angles, right? On the one hand, you could say that 80% of manufacturing, kind of the mid-tier manufacturing, and really software implementation adoption rates still fairly low. There's a lot of pilots, a lot of executive interest, but there's also a lot of challenges in terms of adoption. But then you see certainly some companies, the Teslas, the John Deeres of the world, that are embracing the technology, forging ahead. And we also see hardware OEMs, hardware technology companies that are seeing that they're losing, let's say they're losing bids for projects because the bids are going to companies that integrate software in hardware, and the decisions are being made based on the software component of the system as opposed to the hardware component, which is being viewed a bit more as a commodity. So we see kind of different perspectives in maturity, adoption, where the market is. How do you see this as a company that's selling into quite a wide swath of industries and maturity levels in companies?
I would say pretty spot on assessment in total. I see it very, very similar. I think what you'll find is the companies that have a clear understanding of where their operational gains are made, right? So in areas of, let's say, large capital assets that are out there, and particularly if your business model now involves selling those as a lease, or even more so, let's just say that Caterpillar and John Deere want to move from selling construction equipment to selling the hole in the ground, right? What does it take to actually put a hole in the ground? You start to understand that the way that you monitor your offering, how you bring that to bear, requires a different business strategy. And so I think all the different prospects that you laid out there on how companies approach it really comes down to how strategic is it to the organization and how well aligned are they. So to a product developer who's trying to enhance their product a little bit, it may be really difficult for them to have a large strategic undertaking, and so therefore they may take some small baby steps along the way. Maybe deal with it in the components that they have control over, for example. Whereas larger organizations might be able to take bolder, bigger initiatives that allow them to align across different aspects of their business. And we've kind of outlined a little bit of this, and our CEO has done some work with Professor Porter on from Harvard Business School on, what are the organizational impacts? And what you'll see, IoT is one of these unique places where it cross-cuts so many factions of a business. It doesn't necessarily clearly align to any one particular buyer based on their behavior. But the more strategic the customers are aligning themselves, especially when you factor in like their P&Ls that each person has and so forth, those success patterns generally emerge a lot more clear when they are aligned. So a little bit long in that explanation, but I think it varies because of how strategic or important the strategy is to an organization.
If you look at, let's say, comparing your traditional customer base and then comparing the customer base that is actively adopting IoT solutions, how do these compare? Do you see that it's primarily the multinationals that are able or willing to devote significant strategic resources into high-risk bets that are doing investments in IoT, or do you see also smaller companies doing it, but maybe just investing a different way? How do you see this comparison today?
I would say on some of the smaller companies, or maybe companies that have products that are deployed in a broad geography. Let's just say even across North America or China, for that matter. If they're looking at simple operational efficiency type stuff, like how do I prevent a truck roll? And let's use an ATM as an example. We've all pulled up to an ATM and we've seen that error message that says, "Hey, this ATM is currently being serviced." And it's frustrating because you can't get your money out of the machine. But at the same time, if you look around, there's nobody present. There's no one physically there, and so they took a moment to remotely service that ATM. And if you think about it in a classic sense, Diebold, who makes the ATM machines, at least the high-end ones, for them to roll a truck, it could be, a pretty expensive proposition, several hundred, if not a couple $1,000s to send somebody. And so in their business, it's maybe relatively simple to say, could I drive, 20, 30, 40%, operational efficiency in just field service by being able to remotely access and administer that equipment. So that's maybe I'll call that on the simple end. In fact, that is that idea of remote monitoring and remote diagnostic and service is probably one of the leading service use cases that a lot of organizations get started with. That's not transformational to a business model, though. That's really just driving some operational efficiency, better margins, and so forth. When you start getting into transformational sales models and engagement models for offering your product, then your scope starts expanding and becomes more strategic in how the company chooses to execute that. Kind of staying outside of the factory, I think that's a IoT inside the factory is a very different proposition. They can have some of the same benefits, but in the factory, there's a lot to do with monitoring and maintaining the efficiency of the lines, making sure that the equipment is available and that there's no unplanned downtime, because they're really kind of either guarding their risk, the risk of having a piece of equipment go down on a line at 250,000 to $1 million an hour, or the understanding of how much quality they're actually producing. So I think the variables inside their factories are going to be considerably different from the variables that are associated with products that go out and live in various different environments outside their control.
I think this transformation versus tactical is an interesting point. So when you're initiating a conversation with a new customer and they're likely going to be looking to you for some guidance on how to approach this new area, do you generally direct them towards one of these thought processes, either transformational? Let's think from the start how IoT might change your business and take kind of a holistic perspective, or do you encourage them to look at one particular or a small selection of pain points and look at, okay, how can IoT in the next 12 months help you to achieve a specific benefit, and you can start to lay the foundation and then build on that organically? Or is it, maybe a bit of an assessment based on the capabilities of the customer who you're talking to? How do you make that decision of which thought process?
Is a great way to kind of lead into how we engage with customers. So I'll give you a few different pieces here. So, one of the things I think that, works really well is setting the tone with a customer. And so we would say, think big. If you could think, at a grand scale, what would you ultimately like to do? And that might involve having the stakeholders say, how would they ultimately like to transform their business, right? Are they looking at a new business model, whatever it might be? But put that on the table and understand what that ultimate goal would be. And then, we would kind of back it up by say, so think big, start small. So one of the biggest problems that we see is a lot of organizations just overanalyze and go super huge on all the accoutrements they might need for that strategy, but it's almost unachievable. And in fact, I have one customer, they made a great comment. They said, we could spend a year analyzing this thing, but when we did a real agile, fast, kind of start small, scale quickly approach to it, we found we were 90 degrees off from the market requirements. Like what we thought our customers wanted versus what we needed, we were so far off. And so this idea of having a 2 or a 3 year long, enterprise class project, to get all the requirements right, what we're finding with IoT is you need to move a lot faster to kind of narrow it down. So, just to kind of recap, the idea is, think big, start small, and scale quickly. And I think a few of our partners have ultimately used that in some of their marketing. But that doesn't help a customer. That's a kind of a way to kind of operate or go through things. And what PTC has done is we've then separated these into categories. We call them transformation journeys. So we will approach a customer and say, hey, relative to a domain problem in digital engineering, what are the outcomes that you're looking for? Is it you want to offer product as a service, meaning, do you want to sell that piece of equipment that puts the hole in the ground? And so you're basically buying the hole. Or do you want to, maybe do you want to have just better quality, better product quality, better insight? On the manufacturing side, we do things similar where we, kind of set up these outcomes that we think that most manufacturing organizations, so think inside the factory, are interested in. And then lastly, on service, a service transformation journey. So you want to, fundamentally change how your service network, your dealerships, and all the service technicians, how you, dispatch them, get them out there and hands on. And so what we've done is kind of created these frameworks and a series of outcomes, and then no two customers can actually do this the same way. They would all say that's part of their competitive advantage. But what we do is, along that journey is kind of map how do we get from wherever their current state is today, to what their desired outcome is, a year, 2 years from now, and the steps along the way. That's been incredibly well for us to help organize I'll call it the abyss of potential ideas into a sense of structure that can give a customer a sense of accomplishment and achievement. So we've been doing that for a little over a year now, and that's been incredibly constructive for the conversations that we have with customers to get them started.
Yeah, I love that concept. Think big, start small. I think able to apply design sprint methodology, right, to environments where traditionally it was really large enterprise implementations, high risk, high cost, and we have the opportunity now with IoT platforms to break those down and take more of a piecemeal approach. Talk to me a bit about who you're working with on the customer side. So who decides, who purchases, who implements these solutions are, as you mentioned, they're crossing silos. They're going from the executive down to the shop floor in terms of who's touching the systems. So quite complicated from a stakeholder perspective. What does where do we usually start, and then as you expand and implement a solution, who tends to be involved and how?
Maybe I'll split this into two categories of customer types. One we would say is, and it's a relatively new category for PTC, is to work with partners directly. And they're looking for an IoT platform to help them, establish an IoT type of offering. So think of like a telco provider or a somebody who's getting into offering a new traffic management solution or something like that, and they want an IoT platform at the heart of that offering, if you will. And so we've had good success in the last 2 years of working and finding and engaging with these new solution developer and partners that are looking for a platform. Those are, I would say, a little bit complicated in that they're essentially engaging a software company like PTC in a way to package our software with their offering, and then jointly kind of they take that to market. And so we work with their organizations, generally their product development team, if you will, to kind of create that offering. I would say there's a little, depending on who you're engaging with, oftentimes the complexity there is in the partner relationship aspect, not so much in the technology. But then when you marry the technologies together, they can have a pretty profound offering. On the flip side, when we talk about PTC's traditional customer base, so think of anybody that designs, engineers, manufactures, and services a product. So a lot of the automotive OEM type suppliers, a lot of the European automotive companies, Toyota in Japan, and so forth, as well as every major medical device company that you might be able to put your finger on. Like I said, it's a pretty diverse spectrum of organizations that engineer and manufacture products. When we're engaging them, what we're finding is it's quite cross-functional. I'll give you an example. Let's just pick a service use case. I just want to monitor the product, remotely monitor the product, maybe do some software update to that product, and remotely service that product. Really simple, highly valuable use case, probably at the top of the IoT use case list. But if you think about it, the buyer, the person who's most interested, is in service, right? So you have a VP of service that needs this. The challenge is they have to decide, are we creating an offering that allows us to brownfield retrofit not just our products, but maybe competitive products that we have under management. So think of like buildings, so elevators, escalators, people movement, and environmental controls. You've got a whole number of different manufacturers that make those, but service organizations are now going heterogeneous. They're trying to monitor all that equipment. So they may not have the design capability to build it into the product. You may have a product that's out there for 20 or 30 years that they still want to service. And so they have to think through, am I engineering a new add-on service product, or am I engineering it into the product? And I make that distinction because now when you're talking about engineering it into the product, that VP of service who's interested in this now needs to work with that VP of engineering to say, hey guys, I need these product features in there so that we can have a more efficient, effective, service organization, better margins for all of us, and so forth. And then when you get to that VP of engineering, they definitely know how to do embedded system design, software design, and all that sort of stuff. But they've never built a cloud scale architecture before to, connect to all these devices that are out there. And so enter a little bit of an IoT platform for them. They might start, choosing, but because they don't have the domain expertise of keeping that infrastructure alive, enter in a traditional business like a CIO, or in a business that's going through transformation, maybe a chief digital officer, or someone equivalent, who's then setting maybe organizational strategy on how to do that at large, right? So now you have this cross-cutting nature where that CDO or CIO is a very, very strong influencer and decision maker. And then, questionable as to whether the product management team, the VP of engineering, is the actual economic buyer, or service is the economic buyer. And so there's it's just a real interesting mix when you get into the organization as far as who's involved in the conversation. It's not as simple as selling CAD to the VP of engineering, for sure. I can tell you that.
Thanks. That's a great overview. It's certainly not simple, varies very much by company. This is a good transition actually to a deeper look at PTC's IoT technology portfolio. I'd like to dive into that a bit solution by solution. We're going to do that in the next podcast. Before we do a transition over, Steve, let me put you on the spot. Can you highlight one or two trends that you see coming out in the next 24 months, where we're going to begin to see companies implementing use cases, implementing solutions that in the past have been maybe pilots, so we really haven't seen them out in operation? What do you see on the horizon?
I think you're going to see, particularly in the factory, because there's an incredible abundance of connectivity opportunity in there, a lot of opportunity for organizations, especially in Industry 4.0 terms, to use the European version, of providing monitoring and understanding of equipment, whether it's pumps and motors and other assets, creating these value-added service offerings, whether it's a ABB or a Bosch or anybody like that, and then ultimately selling that type of an IoT offering back into those customers to give them even more visibility and insight into how their equipment is operating. We're definitely seeing a lot of excitement, if you will, by in that particular portion of our business. It's an area where PTC is certainly focusing on as well and providing technology to do that. On the other end, I think while we can talk about IoT in its pure sense, there's an amazing relationship with augmented reality. And if you think about how do I deal with this treasure trove of data, almost too much data for us to humanly process. Can I visually process it different by looking at it in context of machines and equipment and things and products? And so we have see a growing area where augmented reality is, I think it's still a little early, but combining these things together, PTC certainly has a lot of thought leadership in driving these things. But those two worlds coming together, like how do I make augmented reality, really bona fide and valuable inside the organization? That trend will quickly accelerate in the value of IoT data. Both product and enterprise system information will make that, we'll start to push on that. So those two items I think are the big areas next 12, 24 months where we'll see a lot of activity.
Let me ask a quick follow-up on the first item, the Industry 4.0. In China specifically, there's a lot of hype, a lot of government policy driving implementation, a lot of activity in terms of events, so driving awareness. What are you seeing in terms of actual adoption? Are you also expecting this to be peaking in Shanghai or in China in the coming 1 to 2 years, or do you still see a mass adoption in China more in the 3 to 5 year timeline?
There are some Chinese customers that are actually moving early, partly because they're getting the operational benefit and insight and so forth faster. I think, was it the China 2020 or I think it's China 2025 initiative that they have? It's kind of outlining some of that. So we've done a lot of great work in China with those organizations trying to create visibility. I think they're also watching the world, if you will, in terms of what emerging trends and value are being created out of Europe in particular and in the United States. And so there's I would say a cautious sentiment in terms of them applying it to what they're doing, but I think they'll catch on very, very quickly once they understand where the value capture is.
Steve, thanks so much for taking the time to walk through us today. Where can people learn more about your IoT portfolio at PTC?
They can either start at ptc.com, or I'd encourage them to take a trip through thingworx.com, which is going to give you a very IoT straight up and in your face point of view. And for developers that are actually looking to kind of get immersed in our technology, get access to free trials and documentation and so forth, we have a ton of information that's widely available on developer.thingworx.com.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. We help to accelerate digital transformation by advising business leaders on how to integrate IoT technologies into their operations and products. We appreciate your thoughts, suggestions, and of course your reviews, And if you have an interesting project, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. You can write me at eric.walenza@iot1.com.